I grew up in a small coastal town where everyone seemed to trust each other. My parents managed a family restaurant, and my sister and I used to help out after school, wiping tables or carrying crates of soda. She was always the dreamer, the one who talked about changing her life in grand ways, moving to a big city, owning a mansion, driving a fancy car. I, on the other hand, believed in practicality, a stable job, a decent apartment, maybe a road trip once in a while. Despite our differences, she was my sister, and I felt responsible for her. I still remember how we'd sneak out to the pier late at night, laughing about our future ambitions under the flickering lamp posts. Those memories made me believe we'd always be on each other's side, no matter what. It never occurred to me that one day she'd betray my trust so completely that I'd be left trembling on a courtroom bench, wondering if I could ever forgive her, or myself. When she first called me about her troubles, I was in my office downtown, trying to finalize a draft contract for an important client. My phone rang, and I saw her name flash on the screen. She had this quiver in her voice, like she'd been crying. She said she'd gotten into some financial trouble, overdue bills, credit card debts, all piling up faster than she could handle. She sounded so desperate, I felt my chest tighten, as if a giant fist was squeezing my heart. I pushed aside my looming deadlines and listened, nodding silently. It became clear she owed a significant sum to multiple sources, a few banks, a couple of private lenders. Some were hounding her daily. She said she needed my help to clear those debts, just so she could sleep at night. She promised she'd pay me back within a year, her exact words, "I just need a lifeline, something to help me breathe again." At first, I wasn't sure what to say. I'd saved a decent amount over the years, partly in a retirement fund, partly in a separate account for emergencies. She was my sister, though, and I couldn't ignore her pleas. I told her to stay calm, that we'd figure something out. She fell silent for a few seconds, then whispered, "Thank you. You're my only hope." After I ended the call, my chest felt heavier than ever, but I tried to reassure myself that family came first. I remembered how she once brought me soup every day when I was sick for a week in high school. She might have been impulsive, but she had a good heart. I told myself that once she cleared her debts, she'd get her life back on track. She'd focus on something steady. That naive optimism would come to haunt me in ways I could never have foreseen. I arranged to transfer a large sum to her checking account, a bigger chunk than I'd ever parted with in my life. I didn't want to enable her, so I made it clear, use this only to pay down the debts. Don't do anything else until everything's settled. She didn't hesitate. "I promise," she said, her voice breathless with gratitude. "I'll make the payments right away. And then I'll work 2 jobs if I have to, so I can repay you." She even told me she'd send proof of the transactions, receipts, bank confirmations, whatever it took to ease my mind. For a while, I heard very little from her. She'd shoot me a text saying, "I'm busy with extra shifts. Tired, but I'm doing okay." Meanwhile, I'd see photos she posted online showing lunch breaks at cafe terraces or nights out with friends. In the back of my mind, a small seed of worry began to sprout. I tried to brush it aside. Just because she posted a selfie at a restaurant didn't mean she wasn't paying her debts. Maybe she just needed a break. Weeks stretched into over a month. Every time I tried to ask for updates, she'd wave me off with vague reassurances. I was frustrated, but gave her some space. The last thing I wanted was to nag her constantly. Then, one Saturday, I was driving to my parents' place for a casual family gathering. That's when I saw it. A bright red luxury car parked in my parents' driveway. It was sleek, polished, and screamed money. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. As I got out of my car, my father emerged from the house, grinning ear to ear. "Did you see your sister's new car?" he said, pride evident in his voice. She just pulled in. You should check it out. I felt my blood pounding in my ears. My sister was standing next to that gleaming beast, flipping her hair back, explaining all the fancy features to our mom. She seemed so carefree, tossing around phrases like sport mode and fully loaded interior. I barely remembered walking up to her. My hands felt cold, my heart beat loud. She glanced at me with a nervous smile. Isn't it incredible? She asked, her tone too bright. I got a great deal. It was as if the world fell silent around me. My stomach churned, and I forced myself to exhale slowly. She must have read the expression on my face, because her smile wavered. She tried to explain that she'd already paid off most of her debts, and had some leftover funds to put down on a car lease. My father was still beaming, unaware of the tension. Meanwhile, I fought the urge to scream. Instead, my jaw clenched so tightly that it hurt. I managed a neutral tone, we need to talk. Alone. She nodded, avoiding my gaze. I felt a faint tremor run through my arms as I realized something terrible. She'd used my money to buy that car, or at least a chunk of it, despite insisting she was drowning in debt. She tried to act casual. We stepped away into the backyard, near my parents' rickety old shed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and I could see hers flickering as she shifted from foot to foot. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, where did you get the money for that car? Her face reddened. She stammered something about a lease agreement, about how she'd been approved. I pressed on, and how exactly did you pay off your debts? Show me the receipts you promised. She looked away, chewing her lip. My teeth were nearly chattering from the rage I was trying to suppress. Eventually, she admitted she hadn't cleared everything yet, she'd just made minimum payments, enough to keep the collectors off her back for a while. But there was a special offer on this luxury car lease, and she thought it was too good to pass up. She insisted it was an investment in her image, claiming she needed a nicer vehicle for a better-paying job she was interviewing for. I could barely believe my ears. My entire body felt rigid, as if I was made of stone. After a few deep breaths, I told her this was unacceptable. I demanded she either sell the car or find a way to repay me immediately. She lashed back, eyes flashing with defiance I hadn't seen before. She said she'd do it in her own time. She scolded me for not trusting her. Don't act like you know my life better than I do, she snapped. I've got it handled. Stop trying to control everything. My hands clenched at my sides, nails biting into my palms. Deep down, I still clung to the hope she'd realize how reckless she was being. I wanted so badly to believe she'd come around if I just gave her a stern wake-up call. For the next few days, I wrestled with my anger. I tried texting her, calling her, leaving messages that urged her to do the responsible thing. Sometimes she'd respond, telling me to back off, other times she ignored me outright. Meanwhile, my parents didn't quite grasp the seriousness of the situation. They assumed it was just a typical sibling squabble. They even told me not to be so uptight, that she'd return the money eventually. Every time I tried to explain the depth of her debt, or how she'd lied, they changed the subject. It felt like I was screaming in a soundproof room, nobody really heard the panic in my voice. A few weeks later, the first real blow arrived. I got an alert from my bank about a large withdrawal from the account I used to help her. But it wasn't me withdrawing. My password had been changed, and someone had set up a new payee. I froze in shock. Then a cold dread seeped in. My sister had access to my login details from earlier, when we'd sat down together to handle her debt payments. Maybe she'd saved the passwords. I felt a sudden wave of dizziness, like I was about to collapse. My hands shook so much that I could barely dial the bank's customer service line. I spent hours on the phone, verifying my identity, explaining the unauthorized transaction. The representative on the other end sounded sympathetic, but told me the dispute process could take weeks, possibly months. In the meantime, that money was gone. It didn't take a detective to figure out who did it. I wanted to drive straight to my sister's place and hammer on her door, demanding answers. But a sick sense of betrayal kept me rooted in place. Why would she escalate things like this? My heart pounded with a mix of rage and despair. Eventually, I mustered the courage to confront her in person. I found her at her apartment complex, leaning against a shiny new car, tapping on her phone. The sunlight glinted off the hood, reminding me of the money she'd thrown away. The second she saw my face, her posture changed. She went from casual to defensive in a heartbeat. I asked her about the unauthorized bank withdrawal, my voice quavering. She gave me a startled look, then quickly feigned ignorance, claiming she had no idea what I was talking about. But she couldn't maintain eye contact. My fury burned so hot that I trembled all over. I told her I'd be forced to press charges if she didn't come clean. Her reaction stunned me. Instead of apologizing or even pleading, she glared at me and said, "Go ahead. See what happens." My jaw dropped. She then accused me of meddling in her finances, of pushing her to some desperate measure. Her logic was twisted. She painted herself as the victim, claiming that if I had just given her more time, she wouldn't need to do things I might consider unethical. I felt a hot flush of rage creeping up my neck. But beneath that anger, a cold sadness settled. I realized I didn't recognize this person anymore. I spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, playing out scenarios in my head. Could she have some kind of addiction, or be under the influence of bad company? The sister I remembered from our high school days wouldn't have done this. The next morning, I began the process of filing a formal dispute with the bank. The paperwork was mind-numbingly detailed. I had to prove the transaction was unauthorized and that I'd taken steps to secure my account. They also hinted that I might need to file a police report for them to proceed seriously. That meant taking the step I'd been dreading, actually naming my own sister as a suspect. Before doing anything irrevocable, I spoke with a lawyer recommended by a colleague. She was blunt, telling me family disputes over money can become nightmares. She explained that if my sister claimed I had given her permission, verbal or otherwise, it would turn into a he-said-she-said scenario. The legal system was all about evidence, she warned, and relationships can muddy the waters. She advised that I gather any written communications, texts, or voicemails where my sister admitted wrongdoing, or at least acknowledged the loan terms. I felt physically sick. Part of me wanted to just walk away, consider the money lost, and never speak to my sister again. But it was more than just a few dollars. It was a substantial portion of my savings, and the sense of violation gnawed at me. My lawyer suggested that, if it escalated, we might consider freezing her assets or garnishing her future wages. But even that process was complex, petitioning a court, proving the funds were stolen, dealing with potential countersuits. The entire prospect made my skin crawl. This was my sister, not some stranger. All this legal talk stirred something in me. Memories of us playing on the beach, building sandcastles, her giggling while chasing seagulls. How had it come to this? I wanted to believe there was still a kernel of decency left in her. Maybe this was all some sort of misunderstanding or meltdown. Maybe if I found the right words, she'd realize the damage she was causing. But every time I tried to contact her, she either dodged me or sent cryptic texts about how I had forced her hand. Despite my reluctance, I filed the police report. The officer who took my statement didn't look particularly shocked, he'd seen plenty of family dramas. He carefully noted the details, asked for copies of my bank statements, and told me to let them know if I found more evidence. Walking out of that station, I felt hollow, as though part of my soul had been scraped out. I half expected my sister to call me, furious about what I had done. But I heard nothing. Just a tense silence that ate at me. Then, out of nowhere, I received a letter from a law firm representing my sister. It arrived by certified mail. I remember standing in my kitchen, the envelope trembling in my hand as I opened it. My eyes skimmed words like harassment, emotional distress, and defamation. It stated that my sister was considering legal action against me for making false allegations that harmed her reputation. I let out a ragged breath, feeling a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She'd effectively declared war, using the legal system as her weapon. I steadied myself against the counter, trying to keep from collapsing in shock. How could she claim defamation when she was the one who took my money? Over the next week, my lawyer reassured me that such tactics were often used to intimidate. But we had to take it seriously. If she truly filed a defamation suit, I'd have to defend myself. This new twist made me realize that she might be even more cunning than I'd given her credit for. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about control, about winning some twisted game. I spent my nights sifting through text messages, emails, anything that showed her admitting she owed me money, or referencing her debts. Each time I found a small snippet that might help my case, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Meanwhile, my parents stayed mostly neutral, pleading with me to work things out without involving lawyers. I tried to explain the situation, that she had threatened me with legal action, that I'd had no choice but to file a police report. My mother sighed heavily and said, "She's your sister. This can't be what you really want." That nearly broke me. Of course it wasn't what I wanted. But I couldn't just roll over and let her drain my accounts whenever she pleased. My father, once so proud of her new car, looked crestfallen, caught in the middle of his two daughters. The frustration of being misunderstood by everyone weighed on me like lead. A few days later, an unexpected turn of events shook the entire situation. I discovered that my sister had defaulted on the lease payments for the luxury car. One of my colleagues spotted a repossession truck hauling a red luxury sedan away just a few blocks from my sister's apartment building. When I heard, my stomach did a strange flip. Part of me felt grim satisfaction. This was exactly what she deserved for being so reckless. But mostly, I felt pity. This was her life unraveling, piece by piece, and she still acted like I was the villain. I used this window of vulnerability to attempt one last direct conversation. I showed up at her apartment unannounced, hoping the shock of losing her precious car might have humbled her. The place was eerily quiet. I knocked, and eventually the door opened a crack. She peered out, eyes dull and bloodshot. For a moment, she let me in. The interior was in disarray, unwashed dishes, trash bags lining the hallway. The stale smell of neglect hung in the air. She looked thinner, her hair unkempt. I noticed final notice bills scattered on the table. It was clear she was on the edge, maybe at rock bottom. For a moment, I saw a glimmer of the sister I once knew. She sank into a chair, head in her hands, murmuring something about bad choices, and no way out. My heart pounded with sympathy, and I reached out to place a hand gently on her arm. I told her we could still find a solution if she agreed to be honest. But then her eyes flickered with something else, resentment or pride, I couldn't tell. She pulled away, snapping that I'd never understand her situation, that I was the golden child with a stable career. In that instant, I realized no matter how much I tried, she saw me as the enemy. I left her apartment feeling cold and empty. A few days after that visit, I was served with official court papers. My sister had followed through, filing a lawsuit alleging slander, emotional damage, and breach of an oral contract, a twisted claim that I had somehow promised not to press her about the money. My lawyer's eyes widened at the complexity of it. It wasn't just a petty threat now, it was a real case on the docket. My nights became sleepless marathons of anxiety, imagining the worst, that I'd lose in court because of some technicality, that she'd spin lies so convincingly I'd be left paying her damages on top of losing the loan money. In a frantic effort, I combed through every text she'd ever sent me, highlighting passages where she mentioned her debts or the agreement to repay. The most crucial piece of evidence was a short voicemail where she apologized for taking more money than she should have and begged me not to go to the police. That at least showed her acknowledging wrongdoing. My lawyer said it might be enough to cast doubt on her defamation claims. But I dreaded the idea of testifying, of having to stand in a courtroom and point the finger at my sister. My stomach knotted at the mere thought. Meanwhile, the bank investigation dragged on, and the police case was at a standstill because it's considered a domestic financial dispute. My financial situation was precarious. I'd lost not just the principal amount, but also faced mounting legal fees. There were moments I wondered if I should just give in, settle with her somehow to end the nightmare. But then I'd recall her smug challenge, "Go ahead. See what happens." That memory stiffened my resolve. I couldn't let her trample me and get away with it. When the court date finally arrived, I felt physically ill. The hallway leading to the courtroom smelled of disinfectant and tension. My sister was there, dressed in a formal outfit that looked new, flipping through some papers with her attorney. She barely glanced in my direction. As we entered, I noticed the judge's piercing gaze, scanning the room as though he could sense the emotional turmoil. Her attorney launched into a convoluted tale about how I had entrusted her with large sums of money voluntarily, how I'd later fabricated this story of theft, damaging her reputation among our family and friends. My jaw tightened, and I instinctively clenched my fists under the table, trying to stay composed. When it was our turn, my lawyer presented the text messages, the voicemail, and a chronological list of suspicious transactions from my account. We showed that a chunk of the money had indeed disappeared around the same time she'd purchased the luxury car. My sister testified, trying to sound calm and rational. She insisted I had verbally agreed to support her financially while she got back on her feet. She described me as a controlling sibling who later changed my mind and accused her wrongly. Hearing those words stung like a wasp's sting. I could see from the judge's face that he was keenly aware this was a messy family feud. He asked pointed questions about the unauthorized transaction, about the repayment plan she claimed we had. My sister deflected, sometimes fumbling her answers. Midway through the hearing, my lawyer played that voicemail. As her voice filled the courtroom, apologetic, strained, and clearly referencing her mistake, my sister's eyes flickered with panic. A hush fell over the room. Even her attorney seemed momentarily at a loss. That was the moment I felt a spark of hope, thinking the tide had turned. But then came the twist. Her lawyer produced documents alleging that I had previously gifted her smaller amounts of money for months, transfers labeled as gifts on the transaction notes. He used those to argue that the large sum I'd given her was also a gift. My face fell when I recognized those old receipts on the big screen in the courtroom. Yes, I had sent her smaller sums to help with groceries or rent once in a while. Could that pattern undermine my entire argument that this was a loan, not a gift? I felt a chill race down my spine. The judge said he needed to review all the evidence carefully. I left that day feeling a tangled mess of emotions. I was furious with myself for labeling those earlier transfers as gifts in the memo lines. My lawyer assured me it didn't necessarily seal my fate. The phone recordings, the text messages still indicated a larger agreement. But doubt clawed at me. Suddenly, it wasn't as straightforward as I had hoped. My sister was cunning, and she or her attorney had carefully curated evidence to muddy the waters. The next few weeks were a blow of depositions and additional filings. I had to gather character references, people who could vouch that I always intended the big sum as a loan, never a gift. Some of my sister's friends, meanwhile, claimed they overheard me saying I'd always take care of her, twisting my casual remarks into some binding vow. Each new legal tactic felt like a punch to the gut. My anxiety soared, and I nearly broke down one night, sobbing into my pillow, uncertain whether I'd ever see justice. Yet something interesting happened. My parents, who had tried to remain neutral, became increasingly alarmed by the viciousness of my sister's campaign. They started to realize I wasn't just picking a fight. I was genuinely being defrauded. My mother pulled me aside after a tense family dinner and admitted that my sister had told them half-truths. My father shook his head, mentioning how my sister twisted his words whenever she needed emotional leverage. This shift gave me a little more courage. At least they finally saw the damage she was causing. As the next court date approached, I prepared obsessively. I rehearsed my statement, reorganized my evidence, and tried to quell the roiling panic inside me. The day of the hearing, my sister looked pale, as if the stress had taken its toll on her too. Her lawyer hammered on the idea of a sibling understanding, while mine focused on the objective facts, account statements, messages, and her own admissions. After nearly an hour of back and forth, the judge spoke, his tone measured. He acknowledged the complexity, the family ties, and how lines could blur. However, he said the documentation I provided strongly indicated my sister had knowingly misrepresented her intentions when receiving the money. He also cited the voicemail as compelling evidence that she'd taken funds without my consent. Finally, he concluded that her defamation claim was not substantiated by any factual basis, no actual slander or malicious falsehood was proven. The final judgment ordered her to repay a portion of the amount immediately, with the remainder structured in monthly installments. The judge also dismissed her lawsuit against me, effectively ruling in my favor on every key point. I felt a surge of relief so powerful that I nearly slid off my chair. My sister just stood there, her face crumpling in a mix of shock and fury. For a moment, I thought she might scream or protest, but she remained silent, trembling. When we exited the courtroom, she brushed past me without a word. Outside, the sunlight felt warm and unreal. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs with the taste of victory, tinged with sadness. This was my sister, after all, and part of me had hoped we might reconcile. But the hurt ran too deep. The betrayal, the lies, the legal attacks, none of that would vanish overnight. My lawyer gently patted my shoulder and said, "At least you can move on now, with the court's decision behind you." Still, collecting the money wasn't as simple as the judge's gavel implied. Her bank account was nearly empty, and my attempts to garnish her wages led to more red tape. My lawyer and I had to file follow-up paperwork to enforce the judgment. There were delays, excuses, attempts on her side to evade full payment. The entire process dragged on for months, each step requiring more documentation, more legal fees. Sometimes I asked myself if any of this was worth it. But every time I received a small installment, I remembered that I was fighting for my own financial stability. I was also fighting to prove that manipulative behavior has consequences. As the repayment process inched along, our family gatherings became tense. My sister avoided them or showed up briefly, refusing to meet my eyes. My parents didn't push us to reconcile anymore, they'd seen the lengths she went to. Their disappointment was evident, but they rarely spoke about it outright. Meanwhile, word spread among relatives and family friends, leading to gossip that filled me with a strange mix of shame and vindication. Some labeled me cold-hearted, while others whispered that my sister had always been trouble waiting to happen. I tried to keep my head down and focus on getting my life back on track. Time passed, and the memory of the legal battles began to dull. Bit by bit, I recovered most of what I'd lost. I learned to be more cautious, more guarded with my financial details, even around those I loved. The pang of betrayal still hovered, especially when I'd see siblings out together, laughing as if no wedge could ever come between them. My sister and I, once the duo who shared secret giggles on the pier under moonlight, now barely exchanged words beyond obligatory greetings. Looking back, I see how her desperation, pride, and maybe deeper issues I'll never fully understand led to that ordeal. I also see my own naivety, how I ignored warning signs in the name of family. I tightened my grip on illusions of loyalty, even as the truth seeped through the cracks. I'm not proud of the fury and resentment that consumed me, nor am I proud of taking her to court. But I don't regret standing up for myself. Sometimes you have to draw a line, even if it means severing a bond you thought was unbreakable. I haven't fully forgiven her. I'm not sure I can, or if she even wants my forgiveness. The last time we spoke, it was brief and civil, exchanging awkward pleasantries at a cousin's wedding. She asked how I was doing, her voice subdued. I saw flickers of the sister I used to know. For a moment, I felt my heart twist with nostalgia. But then I recalled those endless nights agonizing over lost money and shattered trust, and I could only nod stiffly, forcing a polite smile. In the end, I found a measure of closure. The final repayment cleared my account one cold winter morning, and it felt surreal to see that deposit come through. It didn't erase the betrayal or magically rebuild our relationship, but it was a tangible reminder that I had fought for what was rightfully mine and won. My sister may never admit she was in the wrong, and maybe she'll keep chasing illusions of a lifestyle she can't afford. I've accepted I can't change her. I only hope one day she realizes the damage she's done, if not for my sake, then for her own future. For now, life goes on. I stick to my practical ways, watch my accounts like a hawk, and remember the lessons I learned the hard way. Trust, once shattered, can't easily be pieced back together. Sometimes, the only way forward is to accept the scar it leaves behind. It reminds me that even those closest to us are capable of inflicting the deepest wounds. And maybe that realization, painful as it is how we learn to protect ourselves without losing our humanity altogether.